Hello there. Welcome back to Jennie Designs with Paper and this week's episode of Crime and Coloring, where we take an alphabetical journey through the United States and revisit some of the earliest crimes. Season 2. But before we talk crime, let's talk coloring. I have this My Favorite Things Party Like a Pirate stamp set. I'm going to be stamping all of the images onto a piece of Neenah Classic Crest Solar White 80-pound cardstock with a alcohol marker-friendly ink. There we go. I will be coloring them with my Copic markers and cutting them out with my brother's Scan and Cut so that I can make 3 kid-themed cards. Now that we've talked about the coloring, let's talk about the crime. So this week we're headed to Alaska, and it is a long story, so it will have 2 parts. And last season, I had not yet, when we talked about Alaska, started telling you about the states themselves, so we're going to do that for just a minute. So Alaska was first discovered by Europeans in the mid-1700s when a Russian expedition that was being led by a Danish navigator discovered the Alaskan mainland. Russian hunters soon began coming into Alaska, and they nearly wiped out the native population by introducing foreign disease. By the late 1700s, Russia had established a permanent colony in Alaska on Kodiak Island. And then we have things like the Americans moving to, or the British colonizing America, the American Civil War, the Americans winning the Civil War, and establishing a whole new country. Now, at this point in time, Russia is still in Alaska, but by the 1860s, Russia is nearly bankrupt, and they offered to sell Alaska to the United States, so the Alaska area became a territory. When the territory was presented for statehood, President Eisenhower was in support of that, but there was some real concerns. This was a piece of land that touched the Soviet Union, and this was the height of the Cold War. Another concern was that a huge amount of Alaska was public or government-owned land, and somehow that federally owned land would have to be transferred to state control. However, all things being equal and what they are, on January 3rd, 1959, President Eisenhower signed a special proclamation admitting the territory of Alaska into the Union as the 49th and largest state. Now, dog mushing is Alaska's state official. Nobody's surprised by that, right? And some of Alaska's bizarre moose-specific legislation include laws against pushing a moose from a plane and giving a moose a beer. I feel like those are laws that were passed because somebody said, hey, I wonder if. Alaska is home to America's first museum solely dedicated to hammers. The state holds the U.S. record for the coldest recorded temperature. A low of negative 80 degrees Fahrenheit was recorded on January 23, 1971. Alaska has more coastline than the whole 49 other states combined. It is home to the largest national forest. In Alaska, you can take part in an outhouse race where brave Alaskans compete to be crowned the king or queen of their throne. Alaska has great fishing that draws many people, including the victims of our story today. So like I said, this is a long story because the legal parts of it are interesting. So we're going to start by introducing you to Mark Colthurst. Mark was born on September 5th, 1954, in Bellingham, Washington, actually, to John and Sally Colthurst. And family records that I found listed him as either a only child or having one sibling, and the detail of him having a sister comes into play later, so we are going to say he was the oldest of 2 children. There is not a lot of detail about Mark's early childhood and young life, probably because his death is so dramatic. But by the time Mark was 16 years old, he had entered the maritime profession and had earned a reputation as a hard worker and almost found instant success as a commercial fisherman. Now, Irene K. Hudson was also born in 1954, but in January of that year, and also in Bellingham, Washington. Her parents are Frank and Hazel Hudson, and Irene was their only child. And again, her early childhood and family life is somewhat unreported upon because of the tragedy that unfolds later in life. Somehow, somewhere in Bellingham, Washington, Mark and Irene met. They were married on December 5th in what I believe is 1974, because their first child was born in 77 and they were youngish. So the wedding date, the date was illegible on the marriage records. So I'm going with 1974. But they had a first child in 1977, a girl, and a boy in 1978. And reportedly, when Mark was home, he was a family man. He loved hanging out with his wife and his children, and he was a pretty hands-on parent. However, he was a commercial fisherman, and that meant he had to spend summers away from his children, his family. Now, Mark had a goal of retiring by the age of 50. So that meant he had to have some really big catches in order to reach this goal. He wanted to be able to retire young enough to enjoy his life. To that end, with some financial help from his father, John, Mark spent nearly $1 million on a family-sized deep sea fishing boat named the Investor. Now, the record that I saw said the boat was about $700,000, or just over $700,000, actually. So the plan in buying this large boat was that he could get larger hauls of fish, but also his family could come spend time with him on the boat, meaning he did not have to be away from them as often as possible. So in 1982 in Craig, Alaska, we're going to jump over to Alaska from Washington. Craig is a small town on the southeastern part of Alaska. Its full-time population is just over 1,000 people. So it's not big, but it is well known to commercial fishermen, especially those interested in fishing salmon. On Sunday, September 5th, 1982, the 58-foot fishing vessel, the Investor, pulled into the port of Craig, Alaska, and the ship was being captained by 28-year-old owner-operator Mark Colthurst. On board were Mark's wife, Irene, who was 3 months pregnant with their third child, 5-year-old Kimberly, who was preparing to start kindergarten the next week, and little John, who had just turned 4. The ship was also home to 4 crew members. These crew members were young men who had known Mark before they set sail together. Chris Heyman, Dean Moon, Jerome Kawan, and Michael Stewart, Mark's cousin. All 4 of these young men were 18 or 19 years old with plans to attend or already have attended college, and all 4 of these men were chosen by Mark. He hand-chose his crew to consist of people that were strong, capable, willing to work, and safe for being around his family. So on that Sunday morning, the Investor had a haul of nearly 77,000 pounds of salmon when it pulled into the bay and docked. The plan was to sell the haul for about $30,000, but not in cash money. Mark had a reputation of refusing to work with cash-only industries, and he carried no money or very little money when he was out at sea. So he and his crew had planned to offload the catch on the 5th and get paid, but the Fish and Game Department had temporarily shut down the fishing season the week before. So while they could offload the fish, they could not get paid until the 6th when fishing season opened again. And that meant that Mark and his family and their crew got to hang out in town in Craig, Alaska for a day or so until payment could be arranged. So once the fish was offloaded, the investor was pulled into Craig's North Cove dock, and it was docked. Well, kind of docked. A ship this large and a dock this busy didn't really fit together, so the investor was actually tied to two other ships, the Defiant and the Decade. This meant that in order to get from the investor to the dock and land, you would have to walk across two other ships, kind of like a long gangplank. The ship owners knew each other, so this wasn't the worst thing in the world. And in fact, the Decade was captained by the brother of Mark's business partner. So they knew each other. It was not weird to have to cross each other's boats to get out, to get from boat to shore. The ropes used to tie the ships together were very heavy, expensive ropes that were kept on board for exactly this type of purpose. And when the ships, detached themselves from each other and returned to sea, the ropes would just return to the boat that they came from. Now, the residents of Craig, Alaska did not know Mark or his family. The other ship owners and captains did. He was a familiar face to many of the commercial fishermen in port that night. Mark had not previously brought his new ship into Craig before this trip, and he did so now only out of convenience, because Irene and the children were scheduled to fly out of Alaska back to Washington for Kimberly to start school on Monday. They were scheduled to fly on Monday. Now, if you remember, when I introduced you to Mark, I told you his birthday was September 5th. Well, that's the day that they are docked in Craig, so of course the family decided to celebrate. So they walked across their gangplank of boats and went into town, and they planned to have dinner at Ruth Ann's Diner. In order to pay for the meal, Mark had to write a check to a friend for cash. This is how well known it was that Mark did not carry cash, and that's important in the details of the story. So according to witnesses, the family got to the restaurant at dinner time, and they stayed till about 9:30, and then they were seen headed back to their ship. One of the crewmen from the Decade said that when the family and the crew walked back across the tied-up ships to get to the investor, Little John actually stuck his head into the pilot house on the Decatur the Decade, to say hello. And that was at about 10 o'clock at night on the 5th of September. And that was the last time the family and crew of the investor were seen. In the early hours of the next day, the 6th of September, things were quiet in the port town of Craig, with the exception of a couple of seemingly unrelated weird events. So the investor, Mark's ship, was seen at about 6:30 in the morning floating away from the Decade and the Defiant without engines running. It was moving out of the port and out towards sea. And all of those heavy, expensive tie-down ropes, they were found on the dock of the Decade, not the investor. A crewman from the Decade recalled that he noticed a man about the height and build of Mark in the pilot house of the investor and waved at him, and the man waved back. So this led the crewman to believe that it was Mark piloting the ship. But he did note that it was really odd that the engines weren't running, because it was normal to have your engines idling to prevent the ship from being pushed into another vessel by the tide, by waves, or from the wake of another ship. So it was odd. About 6:45, the captain of the Decade reported seeing somebody on the deck of the investor, and decided that Mark must be heading back out to sea to get an early start on the next run of the salmon fishing season that had just opened. The captain later described the man on the boat as a white man with blonde or light brown hair, slight build, and wearing a red and black plaid jacket. About 45 minutes after that, a crew member from a different ship saw that the investor was beginning to settle into the harbor at Fish Egg Island, about a mile away from where they just left, and it appeared that they had dropped anchor. They were just sitting there. And during all this, the skiff from the investor, the little boat that's used to go from ship to shore, was seen by several town people, and they all just kind of assumed that the people on the investor had forgotten something or someone had brought the skiff back into port to collect that thing or person. So, unusual things that on their own mean nothing. However, on the next day, the 7th, all those weird unrelated events collided. So the 6th of September settled into a foggy night, and when the fog finally lifted in the morning of the 7th, people in town were surprised to see the investor still anchored at Fish Egg Island. It was assumed by people that Mark was headed out to fish and that Irene had gone to the airport. The family, Irene and the children, were scheduled to fly back to Bellingham. And the fact that Irene and the children had missed the flight was on no one's radar. They simply weren't missed yet. Later on the morning of the 7th, there was a young man seen piloting the skiff from the investor around town, and in the hull of the skiff were 2.5 gallons of gas that he had purchased from a fuel supply in town. And the skiff was docked at the Craig City Harbor. Around 4 p.m., a trawler called the Casino noticed some smoke coming from the direction of the still anchored investor. So the crew members from the Casino informed the state troopers about a potential fire and headed out toward the smoke. Their plan was to get anybody on the boat off and then keep the fire at bay until the Coast Guard could get there to put it out. While in transit, they passed a man in a baseball hat piloting the investor's skiff headed back into Craig. They exchanged a few words, and based on their conversation, they presumed that the man was headed into town to get help. So they continued toward the investor to be of assistance. According to people in Craig, the young man docked at the skiff in the city dock, spoke to at least 3 people, claiming he was going for help. He was described as a young white man with a scarred or pocked face, slightly blonde, oh my goodness, I can't even speak. Blonde or light brown hair with a slight build. There we go, I got it out. They really didn't give him much notice because the fire on the investor was beginning to be visible from land, and it seemed to be consuming the ship and growing out of control. Later, the skiff to the investor was found docked nearby, abandoned, and undamaged, and the man piloting it seemed to have slipped away in the chaos. So the crew of the trawler Casino arrived at the ship that was now engulfed in flames. They began to do their best to get the flames out and the fire under control, but they were not prepared or equipped for firefighting. The fire was raging from the pilot house of the investor, and the best the casino's crew could do was keep the fire from spreading to land or other nearby boats. They were eventually joined by local fishermen and some state troopers that had responded to their original call, but it was several hours before the Coast Guard could get there with 2 water pumps to put the fire out. As the fire was beginning to be controlled, emergency responders and investigators boarded the ship looking for survivors. What they found was beyond anything they could have been prepared to see. The scene at first indicated that there had been a tragic accident on board, killing all those who were there, but nothing jumped out as being the cause of the fire. And as the investigation continued into the potential cause, the flames would reignite, and that delayed the recovery effort going on at the same time. The delay then made it hard to determine just how many people were on board, and it took several hours to get the flames under control and then extinguished. And for hours and hours, investigators would continue to look for a cause of the fire. The cause was still undetermined, but the scene got darker and more horrible as the day progressed. It was not at all what they thought they were going to find. So on September 8th, first responders and investigators climbed aboard the Investor, and the first remains they found were the burned remnants of 4 people. So these remains were collected and sent to Anchorage for forensics identification. Then on the 9th, autopsies were performed, and 2 of the 4 bodies were identified as Mark and Irene Colthurst. And worse is that they had gunshots to the back of their head, execution style. It was also determined that they were dead before the fire started. There was no carbon dioxide damage in their lung tissue. They didn't breathe in smoke. Eventually, they were able to identify the remains of little Kimberly, the 5-year-old daughter, but they could not determine if she had also been a shooting victim. And then a few days later, the 4th set of remains were identified as Mark's cousin Mike. So they had named the first 4 sets of remains, and they were painstakingly, at the same time, sifting through the ashes and recovering the rest of the remains that they could find. There were 3 full sets of bones and then some other not complete skeletal remains. These were eventually identified as the 3 remaining crew members, Chris, Dean, and Jerome. The only mystery still was that little 4-year-old John. And when the investigation was, quote, finished, it was determined that little John must have been at the very center of the blaze because they found nothing from him. The fire on the Investor was eventually completely put out and burnt, and the burned out hull was towed to shore to prevent it from sinking. But the damage was done. Whatever evidence that wasn't burned in the fire or destroyed by the water was gone. I mean, it was all gone. It was either fire or water destroyed. One thing they did find on board were the charred remains of a Ruger rifle, a .223 Ruger, and some theorized that could have been the murder weapon for Mark and Irene. But there were no bullets that were they were able to identify. Everything was just destroyed by the fire. However, further investigation into the remains and the forensics examiners determined that the murder weapon was actually a .22 caliber firearm. Authorities were not able to determine if all of the victims had been shot, but none of the remains showed any signs of having carbon monoxide damage. So investigators believe that the fire was not actually a tragic accident, but an attempt to cover another crime, a mass murder. So who then was the target? There was no clear motive. There was no clear target. Mark was well liked by other fishermen. The crew on Mark's ship were men that he chose and knew and trusted. And of course, the lack of a specific motive then breeds many theories. There were media reports indicating that police were following up on a drug robbery angle. The idea here was that Mark had made his money running drugs instead of fishing. The police even publicly theorized that somebody on the ship had gotten mad and had a violent argument, and then one of the people on ship pulled out a gun and killed everybody to avoid having witnesses, which doesn't make sense because all of the remains are found except a 4-year-old's. So that really did not go very far. But the idea that the fire was committed to cover up murders definitely was the top of the investigators' theory list. The other thing that comes into play here is that the ship docked closest to the Investor, they were having a party. They were celebrating the end of the fishing season, and they were drinking and they were loud, and they just didn't report anything out of the normal. But all of the crew also said, yeah, we were drunk and partying. So they didn't really, they didn't have anything to add to the investigation. So the investigators determined that following the murders, the killer must have stayed on board and either was planning on what to do next or waiting for the right time. And then in the morning, the killer set the investor afloat, hoping that it would get out to rough seas and, be lost or sunk or whatever. And when that didn't happen, probably because of low tide, the ship got stuck at Fish Egg Island. So the next logical thing for the murderer to do was to set the boat on fire. And this is when all of a sudden people remember, especially the gas station attendant, remembered the young man coming into town in the skiff from the investor, purchasing 2.5 gallons of gasoline and leaving it in the hull of the skiff. Another issue here was the young man with the gasoline in the skiff the same young man that was seen by the crew of the casino as they headed out to the fire? And was it again the same young man that had come into town that as the fire, claiming to be getting help? But September is the end of the salmon fishing season, so most of the crews were headed back to whatever part of the world they called home. Local residents didn't know Mark or his crew personally, so they had no information. And the investigators had to travel back and forth between Bellingham, Washington, and Craig, Alaska, to question potential witnesses, any of them that they could find, which were few and far between. Tracking down people of interest became the name of the game. Now, keep in mind that this is 1982, and by November of that year, the murder and arson was no longer the priority crime. The investigators had to look at, they had to prioritize other more urgent things. If you can think of, a better way to say that, please let me know. But yeah, it became yesterday's news. However, the fishermen in the area collected a reward of $15,000, and they had a vested interest in getting this crime solved. Because what if the killer was one of their crew? Yeah, that's a big if, right? Like a majorly important question to solve here. So by November, the police had released a sketch of a young man who was seen in the skiff by the crew of the casino and the town people and the man who sold the gas. The description varied, with some witnesses saying he was middle-aged as opposed to young, native as opposed to white. But the sketch released described the person of interest as a white male, slight build, 5'9" to 6 feet tall, longish, unkempt, blonde or light brown hair, pockmarked or scarred face, wearing glasses with rectangle lenses. And then when asked by a reporter if they could identify the man in the sketch, one resident of Craig said that he was unremarkable looking and that there were 500 men around that fit the same description. In the spring of 1984, more than a year and a half later, with the return of the fishing crews to the area, the investigation seemed to pick up a little bit of speed. And then by the summer of 1984, the state troopers had narrowed down the list of persons to 3 individuals and eventually to 1. This one person was linked through a web of circumstantial evidence and the inability to remove him from the area at the time of the crime. Several people who knew this man and knew the victims said it was impossible for this man to have been the killer, including some members of Mark's family. In fact, one of his family members even described this new suspect as a really pleasant guy. So how does this guy become the main suspect? Well, on September 10th of 1984, mind you, 82, 83, 84, yeah, 2 years after the fire and the murders, Police announced the name of their main suspect, John Kenneth Peel. He had been taken into custody that morning and was in jail in Alaska. And authorities were charging him with all 8 murders. His bail was set at $1 million. And the only question still remaining in the minds of the prosecution was where the trial would take place. Alaska, where the crime occurred, or Washington, where the victims were and the suspect lived. John was a Bellingham resident as well. The evidence against John was circumstantial. John was known to and known by the Colthurst family and the crew of the Investor. In fact, John had been a crew member for Mark in the 1980 and 1981 fishing seasons, but was intentionally not hired by Mark to work on his new fishing ship. Multiple people said that the relationship between Mark and John had soured, but it was believed, it was common knowledge that John had gotten a job on another ship that summer. And he was actually seen interacting with the family at the diner where they celebrated Mark's birthday the day they were waiting for the payments to occur. Now, meanwhile, in the time since the murders, John has gotten married. They've had a child. He has stopped fishing and taken a job in a shipbuilding yard to support his family. And this was a job that wouldn't require him to leave for months at a time. John did not have a criminal history of any kind. He wasn't linked to drugs or robberies or violence. And yet he was the prime suspect in the murder spree and arson that happened a couple of years before. And what's funnier is that originally the police dismissed him as a suspect. His name had actually come up because of the falling out he had with Mark, but the police decided, no, it's not him after talking to other people. But the state troopers had set up a tip hotline, and multiple people, so more than 2, had called that tip line and told the police they really need to look at this guy named John. You really need to check him out. So, because his name popped more than one time, they investigated him. They even pulled him in for questioning. They gave him a lie detector test that he reportedly failed, which, okay, not admissible, but starting to get some flags here. And still they said it's not him. And then, boom, one morning, all of a sudden, he's arrested and he's held on a huge amount of bail. So we're going to stop the story there because the trial proceedings get interesting. And there's a lot of detail I don't want to leave out. So we are going to catch up with the court proceedings next week. I did try to get this into a 1-episode story, but there's a lot of detail in the trial proceedings that I wanted to chat about because it's fascinating to me, and it really does make the story an unsolved story-ish. So we will get back to that next week, I promise, but I do have a question. If you were listening or watching and you had the option of having 2 30-minute episodes like this, or one really long, almost an hour episode, which would you choose? Leave me a comment down below and let me know, because I seriously consider just letting this go on for an hour. But I do have pictures of Mark and Irene. So I opted not to put the pictures up that I found of their children because that was too much for me. I couldn't handle that. But this is a picture of Mark, and it's actually a picture of him on a fishing boat. I don't think it's a picture of him on the Investor, but it is a picture of him on a boat. And this is a picture of Irene. So thanks for hanging out with me today. I promise we'll be back. Oh, I have one more picture. This is a picture of the Investor. So thanks for hanging out with me. I promise we'll be back with the rest of the story next week. I have a couple of other videos here I think you will like. I've also added that subscribe button. If you have not subscribed, I would love it if you did. Leave me a comment down below. One story, one long episode, 2 short episodes. I really would love to know. Give me a thumbs up and have a really fabulous day.